Okay, hold on.
Okay, okay, Parshas Toldos, which is the Sedra that is devoted to Yitzchak in his capacity as an Ab of Klal Yisrael. Avraham Avinu passes on, and Yitzchak is now the father of Klal Yisrael. And when I say the father of Klal Yisrael, I mean at that time he was the father of Klal Yisrael for all generations. Now, when we take a look at Abraham and Yitzchak, even though Torah always emphasizes the closeness that existed between Abraham and Yitzchak, Vayelchu Yachdav, even to the Akedah, they go together almost as one person. But the contrast, the difference, the way they are presented by the Torah is very clear. Avram is a universal figure. Avram goes from town to town, as the Rambam describes it in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, and he goes and gives speeches about monotheism, about belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He has a tent that has 4 doors. I don't know. Yitzchak might have had a tent with 4 doors also. But the Torah, in talking about Yitzchak, does not emphasize the openness of Yitzchak, how everybody would come to Yitzchak in the manner that they came to Avram. When they came to Avram, Avram would serve them food, beginning of Parshas Vayera. But that's only an example. It wasn't a one-time event. And Avram, of course, as Chazal tell us, would use the opportunity to speak to them about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the source of everything. And Yitzchak is a withdrawn figure. He's a withdrawn figure on all fronts, but especially when it comes to this universal approach. We don't see Avram, the one he had to deal with, Avimelech. But aside from that, we don't see him involved with any people outside his camp, outside his group. We could even suggest even outside his family. And Avram, so Yitzchak is presented as a person who doesn't have any association outside his group. And I'm not asking at this point why Yitzchak was that way, but I'm asking why the Torah presented Yitzchak in that manner. And matter of fact, by Abraham, even at the end of last week's Sedra, at the end of his life, after Sarah dies, he marries Keturah. He has children with Keturah. And before he dies, he sends them away. He gives them matanos. He gives them presents. But in a sense, Avram feels that it's very important. It's not Yitzchak who sent them away, it's Avram who sent them away. Avram understood, at least in the way the Torah presents it, that it would not be a good idea for the children that he had together with Keturah to reside together with Yitzchak. El Eretz Kedem, he sent them to Eretz Kedem, wherever Eretz Kedem is, but you have the impression it was a very distant place. And I want to first understand the lesson that the Torah is trying to tell us. In other words, and this to a certain degree was, if I could use the word, the evolution of Avram. Avram, he gets, as I mentioned, he gets the decree, Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladcha mibeis avicha. Separate yourself from your father's family. And as I mentioned, in my father's name, he says, me'artzecha me'oladecha mibeis avicha. It should be in the reverse order. But it wasn't just a physical separation, a separation of space, but it was a psychological separation. First, a person separates himself from his country, then from his city, and then from his home, from his family. But Lot goes along with him. And ultimately, there's separation from Lot. And then he gets the mitzvah bris milah, which in a sense represents, I am different. Bris milah, the others, up till the bris milah, he saw the separation as just, but not that he was different. But with the bris milah, Avraham is told, you are different. So, and after he is told that he's different, nevertheless, Avram does not change his midah of chesed. He shows chesed, gvilus chasadim, to everybody. And that's what the beginning of Parshas Vayera is. The Parshas Vayera, he shows chesed to everybody. Even though at that point he recognizes the mandate of recognizing himself and recognizing his descendants as being different. And then, of course, after Sarah dies, so Avram, he marries Keturah, and he sends the children Teretz Kedem, which is indicative of Avram's universal perspective. So Avram goes from separation. He's universal. Then he has to minimize his universality, his universal perspective, and then then again he's concerned about the future of mankind. So he has people that he sends out, Teretz Kedem, descendants that he sends out, Teretz Kedem, but he sends them away. Yitzchak has to be alone, separate. What is the idea here? In other words, Avram is a universal figure. Avram is a universal figure and to a large degree, he remained a universal figure. The Mnechei said to him, it's true. They wanted Avram to be identified with them. Avram they rejected that offer because that had to do with the future. But Avram is a universal figure because he represents the idea of the influence that the Jewish people have on the world. And there is no nation. V'hisbaruchu b'zaracha kol goyei haaretz ekev asher shamata b'koli. If we listen to, because there is this tendency to believe that if we act a little bit together with the nations of the world, if we don't separate ourselves, so we will have a bigger influence, perhaps short term. And as history has shown us, it's getting a lot shorter. But long term, the greater influence is not when we are universal, does not emanate from our universalism, but on the contrary, from our recognition that we have a special relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is, I think, what's the idea? And this is very important. Yes, we have an influence. We have an influence on the nations of the world, and we have to have an influence on the nations of the world. And especially when it's a society we live in, when the nations of the world try to adapt all kinds of laws that are against morality. Right now, there is an attempt, and it seems to be succeeding, an attempt to allow for voluntary suicide. And we know about the slippery slope. So when we are part of the community that advocates things that are considered murder, we have to play a role. But we have to understand, and we have to have an influence. But when we have an influence and we recognize that nations identify with Abraham, whether it's Muslims, whether it's Christians, whatever it is, there is no greater universal figure than Avraham Avinu. But there is no Masorah. There is no heritage. Yitzchak could not have that universal figure. Because if Yitzchak had that universal figure, people would say that the nations of the world are attached to the Masorah, and that is certainly not true. And when we try to identify, we have to understand, and it's more than that. And I think the sending away of the sons of Keturah represented, yes, Avram has to have an influence on the nations of the world, but the influence doesn't manifest itself in the Jewish people and the non-Jews being one nation, one group. We are not one nation, we are not one group. We are a separate nation, we are a separate group, and we are certainly a separate religion. And I think we take a look. The Torah in this week's Sedra says, "Vayisrotzitzu habanim b'kirba," and the little translation is, "and the children struggled within her," meaning when Rivka became pregnant with Yaakov and Eisav, two twins. So they struggled with each other. What's the idea that they struggled with each other? But I thought, and then this morning I was looking through the Chumash Masoras Harab, which is a collection of thoughts expressed by my uncle on different sedras. So my uncle says, "Vayisrotzu abanim b'kirba." This is expressive of halacha b'yadua she'esav soni liYaakov. There is a law. We could say it's a law of nature. Now, I'm not trying to say that all non-Jews or even all the descendants of Eisav are soni liYaakov. I'll explain what I think it means. But it's a law of nature. It's that Eisav has hatred to Yaakov, but it's a disposition. But they are able to overcome that disposition, whether it's because of their Masorah, or I think it's something more than that. Eisav is a unique figure from a Torah perspective. Reb Chaim once said that there is a difference between Yishmael and Yitzchak on one hand, and Yaakov and Eisav on the other hand. Yishmael was disqualified from birth to be the successor to Avram. Yitzchak yikar lechazara. From Yitzchak will be your descendants. But Yaakov and Eisav, they both halachically had the chance to be the successor to Avram. As a matter of fact, the Gemara in Dushin tells us that Eisav was considered Jewish. Esav's descendants weren't considered Jewish. But Gemara says, Eisav Yisrael Mumar Have. Eisav was a Jew halachically. And he had a chance to be the successor to Yaakov, to Yitzchak, and of Abraham. But ultimately, and that's the question is, how could Abraham, how could Yitzchak, how could Yaakov buy the Bechorah? The Bechorah is not something that could be transferred. But the answer is very simple. Here there was a special halacha. The way Reb Chaim doesn't answer that question, but Reb Chaim, in explaining a certain Rambam, says, Ki v'yitzchak yikar lechazara. The Gemara says the descendants of Eisav are not considered descendants of Avram and Yitzchak. Why? Eisav himself is a descendant, is a Jew, but his descendants not. Ki v'yitzchak yikar lechazara. From Yitzchak will be your descendants. Below Kol Yitzchak, not from all of Yitzchak's descendants will you have descendants. So at the time of birth, Eisav was born a Jew. Yaakov was born a Jew. But Esav's children were not considered halachically Jewish. So in a sense, here is the struggle. The struggle is who is going to be the successor to Avram and Yitzchak. By Yishmael and Yitzchak, Yitzchak was born the successor. But Yaakov, and a matter of fact, the name Yisrael, according to Targum Onkelos, Ki sarisa im Elohim v'im batuchal, comes from the word sar, an officer. That's the point where Yaakov is appointed to become an Av of Klal Yisrael, a father of the Jewish people. Avram himself, Yitzchak himself, he said to Yaakov, "V'yitain lecha es birchas Avram." You will get the brachos of Avram. You have been chosen through the hand of heaven, not something that Yitzchak planned, but through the hand of heaven. He was chosen to be the successor to Avram and Yitzchak. So so in a sense, there's a certain struggle that goes on. Now, Yitzchak, why did Yitzchak not want why did Yitzchak not realize, okay, he was blind, but he certainly recognized that there was a difference between Yaakov and Eisav. And the simple explanation is that he felt that Yaakov had certain strengths, spiritual strengths, but Eisav also had strengths. Yaakov was an Ishtam Yoshev Olim. He didn't leave the tent. A leader, to a certain degree, has to leave the tent. Even Yitzchak, the Torah tells us, "Vayetze Yitzchak l'suach b'sada." According, there are all kinds of different explanations what l'suach means, but according to one explanation, "Vayetze Yitzchak l'suach b'sada," he went out to talk to people. But Yaakov ishtam yoshev olim, and matter of fact, this is why Yaakov is forced. Yaakov is forced to leave his father's tent, his father's home, his father's camp, and he has to go deal with a Lavan. Because in order to be the leader of Klal Yisrael, Yitzchak thought that he could create a partnership. He could appoint Eisav as the Melech, as the king, as the mundane leader of Klal Yisrael, and Yaakov as the Kohen Gadol, or the Nasi of Sanhedrin, the spiritual leader of Klal Yisrael, and that they would work together. Yitzchak understood Ki v'Yitzchak yikar l'chazara, that all of Yitzchak will be your descendants. But Rivka understood, based on the nevuah that the message she got from Shem and the Ruach HaKodesh, that there'll be two different nations, one having nothing to do with the other. But Rivka also understood, and perhaps this was due. Yitzchak didn't understand, perhaps because of his blindness, because Eisav was able to trick him. He was able to say, how do we take Meiser from Melech, from salt, something that doesn't require Meiser? He was able to put on this false pretense. So Yaakov, Rivka understood that there couldn't be, and it was also probably inspired by when she went to Shem, and Shem informed her that there will exist as two separate nations, so that she understood that Yaakov and Eisav cannot work together, and in a sense, I think that it's important today to understand there are those. Now, I'm not saying there are no areas where we can't have cooperation. Of course, we have to have cooperation. We have to deal with problems that face us jointly. We have to deal about the issues of crime. We have to deal about the issues, social issues, about unemployment. We have to fight disease together. But there are areas where we have to be separate. And religious areas, ritualistic areas, has to separate us. And to a certain sense, this was, and so long as Yaakov and Eisav can't be together, and in a sense there is a struggle. Eisav, it's not just that he wants to be separate, but Eisav, on one hand, he wants to be the successor. That's why he wanted the brachas. He wanted to be the successor to Abraham and Yitzchak. He wanted that Yaakov should be part of his nation. He went with this dream of Yitzchak. Ki v'Yitzchak yikar l'chazara. From Yitzchak will be all your descendants. But the control of the nation. But at the same time, he was not interested in the spiritual aspect of being the successor of Abraham and Yitzchak. He perceived the nation from a perspective of nationhood rather than from a perspective of religion. Ki v'Yitzchak yikar l'chazara, and he would be the leader. After all, he was the Bechor. how was Yaakov able to buy the Bechorah? He was able to buy the Bechorah because that was a special din here. Ki v'yitzchak v'lo kol yitzchak. One of them will be, but it was not determined that it would be Eisav. It was not determined that it would be Yaakov halachically. Because of that, he was able to acquire the Bechorah from Eisav. But they understood that, and this has been the tendency. Why is it Eisav sonei Yaakov? Why is Eisav sonei Yaakov? Eisav is sonei Yaakov because Eisav feels that he should be the Yaakov. He is the successor. And so long as Yaakov is the successor, so he's not the successor of Avram and Yitzchak. There are those who see themselves as the new Israel. And so long as Israel, the Israel of the Masorah, that was given over from generation to generation is there, they know they have a problem. And that's why. Why is it that the nations of the world, and specifically those who Chazal identify with Eisav, they always take a stand against the Jewish people, even when it's against their own interest? Take a look. We hear about what's happening in Africa, how Christians are being slaughtered. But the same religious figures who constantly talk against the Jewish people, the same religious figures who accuse the Jewish people of genocide, the same religious figures that find fault with the Jewish people for defending themselves, and who insist that the Jewish people have to bring food into Gaza that we know is going to be taken by Hamas. They do not even speak on behalf of the members of their own religion. Why is it that way? But the answer is, the reason it's that way is because their hatred, their whole significance, their whole chashivas, their whole importance loses value so long as the Jewish people are able to exist as a nation, so long as the Jewish people are rising up in the world. A number of years ago, I was in Eretz Yisrael. I went to visit Masada, and there were all kinds of groups there. And there was a religious group. There was a religious group at Masada, and their pastor or whatever was talking to them. And I was at the other end of the room, but I heard the discussion. And he was talking about the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Masada was somehow identified with the end of the Second Commonwealth. And to him, that was the way he gave it over. That gave the cheshivas, the importance to their religion. Their religion was built on the fact that God rejected the Jewish people, and the Churban Habayis and the Jewish people going into Gullus was identified with the Jewish people not being the Bechor, not being the B'ni Bechori Yisrael. They were the B'nai Bechori. And so long as the Jewish people exist as a separate nation, so initially they attributed, first they said the Jewish people lost their status, they lost their country, God chased them out, they went into exile, they were no longer the people who was chosen to be the successor of Avram and Yitzchak. It was they that were the successor. As a matter of fact, my uncle mentions, it's brought down by many, that at one time the Pope sent a shaliach because my uncle came out against ecumenical meetings. He took the strongest stand against the meetings, the religious meetings between rabbis, priests, to go to the Vatican to discuss religious issues. And he was also concerned that even on other affairs, we should not become part of them. We have to retain our own chivas, our own importance. It's very interesting. You see today many running to the Pope. In the old days, you would see many people who weren't Lubavitcher Chassidim, but they would go to Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay, Lubavitcher Rebbe was one of the leaders of Klal Yisrael. He was a person who spread Torah, who reached out to all kinds of Jews. Today, many of these people, who do they run to? They'll run to Rome to see the Pope. People take great pride in pictures of them standing with the Pope. But so the Pope talks more against Israel, who is defending themselves against the Muslims who are killing the Christians in Africa. And the who are killing the Christians in Africa, then it talks more against Klal Yisrael for defending themselves. Klal Yisrael has no right to defend itself. Who doesn't have a right to defend themselves? A defeated people. And they don't want to recognize that the Jewish people are not defeated, that we're continuing the battle, that we're coming back to our land. When the Jewish people were in Europe, they would say, go back to Palestine. And when the Jews are in Eretz Yisrael, the land of the Jewish people, they say, go back to Europe. The Jewish people don't have a right to exist unless they become subservient or part of the Eisav group. That's the reason, halacha, she'esav son Yaakov. Hatred, the power of hatred, Freud said, is stronger than the power of love. My father told me that many years ago, he was reading one of Freud's books. And he asked my grandfather if he's allowed, al pi din, to read Freud's books. Because Freud clearly was an apikoros. His book, Moses, really goes against everything that's in the Torah. And my grandfather said, obviously it was based on knowing my father and my father's commitment to Torah, that it was mutter for him to read Freud. He knew that my father would not be influenced by the apicursus that's in Freud's book. He said it's mutter. He distinguished between Freud's writings and Bible criticism. He said Bible criticism, the whole purpose was to push aside the Torah.
Amen.
To show that the Torah was not true. However, when it came, so it was Oster. Freud was not Apicorus. Freud went against the Torah also. But that wasn't his purpose. His purpose was psychology, psychiatry. So that was, so my father said, my grandfather said to my father, but why are you interested in it? Okay, it's mutter for you to read. You're not going to be influenced by it. But why are you interested in it? Who cares? So my father said that he sees some interesting thoughts expressed by Freud. So my grandfather asked him, what interesting thoughts do you see that expressed by Freud? So my father said to my grandfather, he says, Freud, in discussing when Shlomo HaMelech became king and the two women, each claiming that a baby was theirs. So Shlomo HaMelech said, get a sword, we'll cut the baby in half, and each will get half. And the true mother said, no, give the baby over to the other lady. And the mother that wasn't the mother said, yes, that's a good idea. Cut the baby in half. And Freud said that the real mother was the one who said, give the baby over to the other lady. But Freud, the Navi says, excuse me, not Freud said, but Freud explaining it, he says the reason was because the power of hatred is greater than the power of love, and the woman the woman who was not the mother, she was just motivated by hatred. But the power of hatred, whether you can apply it to this or not. So my grandfather said, he says, the Zaydet Zok the Zalbazak, Reb Chaim said the same explanation. There's nothing to be impressed with Freud. Okay, but in any case, the power of hatred is greater than the power of love. And this is what we see taking place today in Eretz Yisrael, regarding Eretz Yisrael. All these nations, they're all being threatened by the same enemies that Klal Yisrael is being threatened. But nevertheless, against their own interests, they go out against Klal Yisrael. And either they don't realize or they don't want to realize what the facts truly are. And what's unfortunate is that many Jews are following in that path. In last week's Sedra, the Torah tells us that, got to turn off my phone. The Torah tells us that Eliezer, when he was sent to to get a wife for Yitzchak, so Eliezer said, maybe Ulai, the woman won't want to come to Eretz Canaan, and she'll want to stay where she is. So should we bring Yitzchak over there? Said the word Ulai. And then when Eliezer repeated it to Rivka's family, again, he repeated the story. And I said to Avram, Ulai, maybe the woman won't want. So should I to come? Maybe we should send Yitzchak. Maybe we should send Yitzchak there. And Rashi, in the repeat, when the Eliezer repeats it, says that he said Ulai. What's the idea? Because Eliezer had a daughter, and he thought that maybe his daughter, who was brought up in the tent of Avram, should marry Yitzchak. He was Moshe. He was in charge of the whole house of Avram. Avram trusted him, even in picking out a shidduch for Yitzchak. And Rivka was brought up in the house of Suel. She had a brother, Lavan. They were over there, Avodah Zarah. They worshipped idolatry. So how is it that so why shouldn't my daughter be? Now everybody asks the question. Rashi only mentions this when the word Ulai, maybe the woman won't want to come, only mentions it in the repeat when Eliezer is talking to the family of Rivka. But why didn't Rashi mention this why didn't Rashi mention it when Avram talked to Eliezer and Eliezer said Ulai, then maybe? And the Gra said, to answer it, he says, because when the Torah tells us about the discussion between Avram and Eliezer, the Torah spells Ulai with a Vav. But when Eliezer repeats the discussion, it's Ulai without a Vav. And the word Ulai without a Vav could be understood to mean Eli, to me. So the question is, and I raised this question actually in Shul this past Shabbos, why didn't the Torah, since Eliezer was thinking maybe it should be his daughter that Yitzchak married, why didn't Eliezer, why didn't the Torah put the vav, take out the vav when Avram when it's talking about the discussion between Eliezer and Avram? Why is there a vav there? Let it be no vav there. And I think the answer is that sometimes we say things spontaneously. And what we say is not the reason that we say it. There is an agia, there's a special reason that's in our unconscious. But when we say it, that's not in our conscience. We say it just spontaneously because of our unconscious, but we don't realize what the true reason is. And it could be that that's the story with Eliezer. Eliezer asked Avram, what will happen if the girl doesn't want to come? And at that point, Eliezer did not realize that the reason he said that was because he had a daughter. That was in the unconscious. But sometimes when we begin to think over what we said, we begin to understand our attitudes. And sometimes our attitudes are of such nature that we understand what was the real motive, what was the real cause for what we said. At the time we said it, we don't realize what it is. But afterwards, when we think about it, we understand. And a matter of fact, I said before Yom Kippur, the Rambam's nusach of vidui, not Yom Kippur, but the rest of the year, Ana Hashem chatasi avisi pashati. God, When a person recognizes he did a sin, he says, Chatasi, I made a mistake. Avisi, I did it knowing. Pashati, I did it as a rebellion. And the question I saw my uncle raises the question, why do you have to say all three? If the sin was done by mistake, you can say Chatasi. If the sin was done with knowledge, you say Avisi. If your sin was done in rebellion, you should say Pashati. And the particular sin that you're saying the Bidi for. Why do you say all three? Because many sins, on a conscious level, it's one thing. On an unconscious level, it's another thing. And we have to do tshuva. We have to do tshuva not only for our attitude consciously, but for our unconscious attitude also. So a person in a sense has to become his own psychologist. He has to be able to evaluate himself. When he does the action, sometimes he doesn't realize. But afterwards, after he evaluates himself, he realizes what the reason. And this will help him not commit the same problem again. But a person has to understand himself. So Eliezer, at the time he said it, unconsciously it was because he knew that he wanted his daughter to marry Yitzchak. But consciously, he just had a question. What would happen? But later on, as he traveled to Aram Naharaim, so when he traveled, he began to evaluate himself, and he understood what the true reason was. And we have to evaluate ourselves, but we also have to evaluate others, because there are many people who don't think, and they go talk about starving people, and they don't think what was the cause of the starvation in Gaza. And the simple answer is, it's the fault of the Jews. And worse than that, there are Jews who join them because they don't think. Very often they don't think because they're not capable of thinking. But most often it's because they don't want to think. And in a sense, we have to evaluate. We have to evaluate why. Why is it that all of a sudden a thinking person should understand? They're all protesting. They're all protesting about Israel on the college campuses and everywhere. Where are the protests about what's happening in Africa? Where are the protests? If you're so concerned, where are the protests? But the answer is, there are those that consciously it's anti-Semitism, and there are those that don't want to believe that it's anti-Semitism. So because of that, they don't think. They don't want to think. And it's more than that. They have a very bad self-perspective of themselves as Jews. And this perhaps is a Golos mentality. We were always subservient for 2,000 years almost to the nations of the world. We had to submit to so much that they imposed upon us. Even attitudes. You read in the paper, I'm not finding fault with them. The Jews in Iran are forced, sometimes forced with weapons, sometimes forced with torture, sometimes forced with being killed out, to issue all kinds of statements. And some of them, after a while, might even consciously believe it against the Jewish people, against the state of Israel. But why? Because they don't want to think. There's an agia, and I'm not finding fault with the Jews in Iran. It's easy to talk about others, but I am finding fault with the Jews in the United States. There are those that are clearly mentally ill, but there are those that just have such a bad self-perspective. And I think there are those, I'm not talking about those that are getting money for it, that there are plenty also, but there are those that they want to see the Jews being totally in Gullus now, as much as they were previously. We're still in Gullus, and until Mashiach comes, we will be in exile, even to a certain degree, the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. Less so, but are also in exile till Mashiach comes. But we, to a large degree, part of the Gullus that we're in now is self-imposed, psychologically self-imposed Gullus. And they want to see themselves in Gullus. And because they want to see themselves in Gullus, their whole chashivas, their whole importance is when they identify with those with the non-Jewish community. And this is the danger of Eisav together with Yaakov. Eisav sonei Yaakov, because Eisav wants Yaakov. It's not just that Yaakov became the successors. No, Eisav wants Yaakov to be subservient to him, because only in those circumstances will he see himself as the successor to Yitzchak, to Avram, Yitzchak, and to Avram and Yitzchak. And this is that what we have to understand, that the succession to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov is something that's b'Mesorah. The nations of the world, they might, it's important for them to be influenced by the example of Avram. And we want them to be influenced by the example of Abraham, but we should not mistake that with the concept of Mesorah. Mesorah from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the giving over from generation to generation to generation, that was only for the Jewish people. Abraham to Yitzchak, Yitzchak to Yaakov, and to the Shvatim throughout the generations. The others, we want them to be influenced, but we don't want to. We cannot believe. We should not believe that they have a Mesorah. They have no Mesorah. It's just an influence. Avram sent them to Eretz Kedem. He didn't want them to see themselves as his successor, and he didn't want the descendants of Yitzchak to see themselves as part of their nation. Klal Yisrael has to be a separate nation. We're interested in the welfare of all people, but we are a separate nation. We're an Am Sgula, and this was the lesson of the Bris Milah, and this was the argument by Yisrotzu Habanim Bekirba from the very beginning. Eisav sonei Yaakov, one will be the successor, and Eisav wants to see itself as the successor. He's not interested in the spiritual. Anochi holech lames v'lama li bechora. But he wants the kingship. He wants the rulership. He wants the control. He wants to control the Jewish people. Today, religion has become part of that sense of control. Uh, they use religion to bring people under their control. It's not really a religious attitude. It's a way of bringing people under their control. So I think this is the lesson that we have to learn. The Eisav son Yaakov, it's not that they can't overcome it, but the natural disposition of Eisav is, I don't want. Truth is, I'm not that interested in being the successor, but I don't want Yaakov to be the successor. And my only way of feeling that Yaakov is not the successor is for me, for Eisav to be recognized as successor, even though I reject the spiritual nature of Avraham Avinu. Okay.